I never thought I would be the kind of person to question my parents about money, especially not money that came from something that I barely even remember, but that somehow affected my entire life. The story had always existed in the background of my life, like some strange footnote that everyone knew about, but nobody really talked about it in detail. When I was a baby, something went wrong during my circumcision, and there were complications, serious ones. I grew up knowing that part of my PP, including the entire tip, had been removed because of a mistake at the hospital. It was always explained to me in a very calm, very controlled way, like it was just an unfortunate medical incident and nothing more. When I was younger, I didn't really understand what it meant. It was just something that made me different, something I tried not to think about too much. But as I got older, especially during my teenage years, it started to affect me more mentally than physically. I worried about relationships, about how I would explain it to someone, about whether anyone would accept me. I never really talked about those fears with my parents because I didn't want them to feel guilty, even though it technically wasn't their fault. Still, I knew the hospital had made a mistake and I knew there had been some kind of settlement. My parents would occasionally mention that the hospital paid compensation and that the money was being kept for my future. This was always the phrase they used, for your future. So I grew up believing that there was some kind of fund somewhere with my name on it, something that would help me one day with college or starting my life. I never questioned it because I trusted them. They were good parents, they worked hard, and we were never rich, but we were always comfortable. We had a house, my dad ran a small business, and my mom helped manage things at home and sometimes with the business accounts. When I turned 18 this year, everything suddenly felt very real. College fees were coming up, my friends were talking about student loans and scholarship, and I remembered the settlement money. I didn't want to sound greedy or ungrateful, but I felt like this was exactly what the money was meant for: my future, my education, my start in life. So one evening after dinner, I asked them about it. I tried to sound casual, like it wasn't a big deal, but I could feel my heart beating faster, like it was beating in my throat. They didn't give me a straight answer. They just said things like, it's too soon, and don't worry about it, and we'll handle everything in due time. That made me uncomfortable. Not because I thought they were bad people, but because they suddenly sounded very vague. And vague answers about money usually mean something complicated or something complex is going on. Over the next few weeks, I asked a few more times, and every time the answer was basically the same. They would reassure me that everything was fine and that the money was safe and that I didn't need to worry about anything. But the more they avoided specifics, the more my mind started going to bad places. I started wondering if maybe the money wasn't in a fund at all. Maybe it had been spent years ago. Maybe there had been bills or debts, or the business needed help, or the house mortgage needed to be paid. I started noticing things I had never paid attention to before. How the house was bought around the same time I was very young. How my dad's business started a few years after the settlement. I started connecting dots that maybe weren't even there. But once those thoughts started, it's hard to stop them. I felt guilty for even thinking that my parents would use money that was meant for me. But at the same time, I also felt like I had the right to know. It wasn't lottery money or some random inheritance. It was compensation for something that permanently affected my body and my life. That thought kept coming back to me over and over again, and eventually it started to bother me enough that I couldn't just ignore it anymore. So one night I decided to just talk to them properly instead of hinting around the topic. I told them I needed to understand what happened with the settlement money and where it was now because I was planning my education and my future. I wasn't angry when I said it, but I was very serious. I think they could tell that this wasn't something they could just brush it off again. They both got very quiet for a while, and I honestly thought that was the moment I was going to hear that my money was gone. My mind was already preparing for the answers. I was already telling myself not to get angry, not to ruin my relationship with my parents over money, not to say something I would regret. That was possibly the longest minute of silence I've ever sat through. Then my dad finally explained everything. He told me that when the hospital settled, the amount was significant, but not the kind of money that would last a lifetime. It was just sitting in a bank account. They spoke to a financial advisor at the time, and instead of leaving the money idle, They decided to invest it into something that would grow and also support the family, which ended up being the house we live in and the business that my dad started. He said that the settlement money became the down payment for the house and the starting capital for his business, and without the money, none of this would have existed. I didn't know what to say at first because I had spent weeks imagining that they had secretly spent it irresponsibly or that it had disappeared somehow. But then he showed me documents, actual paperwork, showing that a portion of the business ownership is legally in my name, proportional to the amount of money that came from the settlement. He explained that technically I am already a part owner of the business, even though I never knew it. He told me that instead of giving me a lump sum at 18 and letting me possibly waste it or lose it, they wanted the money to become something stable that would support me for the rest of my life. He said the business now generates profit, and from now on, he would start transferring a portion of the profit to me regularly, which I could use for my education and anything else I needed. And he also said something that stuck with me. He said that we never thought of it as our money. It was always your money. We just tried to turn it into something bigger for you. At that point, I felt a mix of relief and guilt at the same time. Relief because the money wasn't gone and they hadn't lied to me, and guilt because I had spent weeks quietly thinking that maybe my parents had betrayed me. I didn't tell them how much I had been worrying about it, but I did apologize for doubting them. My mom told me that they didn't tell me all this earlier because they didn't want me growing up thinking that I had some big payout waiting for me when I turned 18. They wanted me to focus on school and life without thinking that there was a safety net of money. She said that they were always planning to explain everything when I was older and mature enough to understand investments and ownership and long term planning. Now, when I look around the house and think about the business, it feels different knowing that technically part of all this exists because of something that happened to me when I was a baby. It's a strange feeling, like something bad that happened ended up building the entire life I grew up in. I honestly had prepared myself to hear that the money was gone forever and I was ready to just accept it and move on. But instead, I found out that not only was it still there in a way, but it had actually grown into something much bigger than what it originally was. And now, instead of just receiving a one time amount, I'll probably be receiving income from the business for years. I still feel a little bad for ever doubting my parents, but I also think maybe it was a conversation that needed to happen eventually. I'm just glad it didn't turn into a fight and that everything turned out better than I expected.